USS England was a Buckley-class destroyer escort, but despite the name, it was not in fact named for the country of England, but rather in honour of an ensign killed in the Pearl Harbor attack, who just so happened to have had the surname of England. Ensign England had been assigned to USS Oklahoma and survived the initial assault, but despite being up on the main deck, and thus having the perfect opportunity to get off of the capsizing vessel, had chosen not to take that opportunity, but instead he went back into the ship 3 times, guiding men to safety even as the list increased. He headed back in a 4th time, but unfortunately it was that 4th time that he never came back from. The Buckleys as a whole were the US Navy's 2nd class of destroyer escorts, albeit they were somewhat large for that particular description, at 1,400 tons standard displacement and around 1,700 tons fully loaded. They were actually heavier than a number of pre-war full-fledged fleet destroyers. With that said, their armament and propulsion were quite different. The Buckleys were designed for around 24 knots, with the actual speed varying somewhat depending on the ship in question. However, they used the heavy turboelectric drive as their propulsion units, which in part accounted for their large displacement, as the turboelectric drive is heavier per delivered horsepower than the more normal geared turbine system of the period. Although it did offer a few advantages when it came to hunting submarines, mostly due to the relatively easy variation of power output and thus the fine control the ship could have over its speed when it was on a hunt. Their firepower was even more at odds with a normal destroyer, consisting of 3 single 3-inch dual-purpose guns and a single triple torpedo launcher for the entire anti-surface armament. The anti-aircraft suite varied on a ship-by-ship basis, but aboard England in particular, this consisted of a single quad 1.1-inch mount and 8 single 20mm cannon. But it was in the anti-submarine department that the ships began to shine. All the space and weight that on a fleet destroyer would have been taken up by more torpedoes and bigger guns was instead taken up by up to 200 depth charges. And in England's case, these were launched not just by the traditional stern rails, but also by 8 K-gun projectors, which hurled full-size depth charges out in various directions. But these required the ship to keep moving fairly quickly, unless it wanted to be in the vicinity of a depth charge explosion, which tended to have somewhat negative effects on a ship's ability to remain afloat. Bearing in mind that one of the primary jobs of a destroyer escort was to hunt submarines, not join them. All of this had one other major disadvantage. To get clear of the depth charge's blast, the ship had to pass over or by an enemy submarine, thus losing sonar contact and giving the submarine precious moments to break contact and evade. To counter this possibility, the Buckleys, including USS England, also carried the British Hedgehog mortar system. This fired a pattern of large spigot mortar bombs ahead of the ship, which allowed an attack to be made whilst the ship still held contact on sonar with the submarine. This differed from depth charges in 2 main ways. Each individual charge was much smaller, which meant they could detonate near the ship without causing major problems. And secondly, because of their small size, the shockwave admittedly wouldn't do that much damage to a submarine either, and so they carried contact fuses instead of depth fuses, meaning that they would only detonate if they scored a hit on the submarine directly. This allowed a smaller warhead to still do damage, and gave a clear indication as to whether or not a hit had been scored, since a miss would just result in silence. But even with a direct contact detonation, it would sometimes take more than 1 hit to kill a large or tough submarine, and hence a large number would be fired at once, whilst the needed accuracy, even for a spread of this size, would come from the fact that, as mentioned previously, a sonar contact could be maintained whilst the charges were being launched. Albeit that one does wonder what the various deep-dwelling sea creatures would think of the various bombardments of Hedgehog mortar rounds that would miss, and presumably detonate on impact with the seabed, assuming that the charges weren't either detonated or crushed outright by the pressures of the deep sea before they hit the seabed. The weight of this system and its reloads also have to be factored in to why the Buckleys had such a relatively seeming anemic surface armament. England went from keel laying to commission in just under 8 months, joining the fleet at the end of 1943, and would arrive in her primary operational area, the oceans around the island of Espiritu Santo, in May 1944. And it would be here that she would enter the history books. It all started relatively normally for destroyer escort missions in this period. Along with USS Raby and the wonderfully named USS George, England was sent to intercept the submarine I-16, a large and heavily armed Type C submarine that had been pressed into service as a rice delivery boat for a Japanese garrison. US Signals Intelligence had intercepted its delivery schedule and had vectored a scout aircraft to confirm the contact. With this established and I-16 spotted travelling along the surface, the destroyer escorts began a line abreast sweep for the submarine using their sonar, as understandably the submarine had dived upon being spotted. Just after 1:30 in the afternoon, contact was established and England launched several attacks with the Hedgehog launcher, scoring a single hit with a second attack, and then almost an hour after first contact with I-16, its fifth salvo managed to score multiple hits. This, in turn, almost cut England's career short, as a huge underwater explosion heralded the end of I-16, but would also bodily kick the stern of England up rather violently, enough to send men sprawling. Much closer, and it could have been a lot worse, the explosion was powerful enough that the two accompanying destroyer escorts felt the shockwave even though they were a mile away. Debris, rather understandably, began floating to the surface, which included a bag of rice in a sealed container, thus confirming the identity of this particular victim. So far, so standard. But also in May, the Japanese decided to play a trap card. They knew the US Navy was gearing up for a major assault, and so Admiral Toyoda ordered Operation Atago into effect. This plan called for the ambush of the American fleet as they advanced to attack. So far, so standard Japanese tactics. But in this particular case, it actually had a relatively decent chance of working. The Japanese knew the Americans were coming, and they knew that one particular route had already been used by Admiral Halsey twice in different raids, and that area was a natural point of passage for a fleet that was hoping to attack almost any of the major Japanese targets that were most likely to be next on the US Navy's to-do list. And so the 7th Submarine Squadron was sent out, deploying 7 submarines across the route to hopefully catch the US fleet unawares. Compared to I-16, these were much smaller RO-100 class Co-type coastal submarines, hence the ability to deploy relatively large numbers of them in one location even this late in the war. At just 200 feet long, they were armed with 4 forward torpedo tubes compared to I-16's 8. And whilst they did not possess radar themselves, they had been equipped with devices designed to detect and warn of US Navy radar and sonar pulses, as well as having very highly tuned sonar and sound equipment. The submarines were assigned to a roughly northeast to southwest patrol line, with the idea that they would be able to detect any US escorts that might try and spot them, and so they could more easily target the valuable troop transports, aircraft carriers, and battleships. But the US Navy had plans of its own. Signals intercepts once again revealed the Japanese Navy's plans, and the 3 destroyer escorts were sent out to patrol, find, and kill the 5 submarines that would be operating in their area. The 2 further submarines would be in another operational zone, but 5 would be quite enough to start with. The overall commander of the operation, Commander Haynes, deciding that simply starting at the northeastern end and working along the line was a good idea, simply killing anything that happened to come into his ship's paths. The first to fall was RO-106. She was caught on the surface on radar in the early hours of the 22nd of May by the George, which, however, failed to hit the submarine as it dived, the encounter being so close as the R-106's radar detector had apparently failed to work. England now moved in and found its accuracy somewhat improved over the I-16 incident, scoring multiple hits on the second Hedgehog salvo, which again resulted in a large underwater explosion and oil slick. Mindful of the Japanese Navy's likely mission, the US ships concluded that they would likely surface at night to recharge their batteries, which would make finding them much easier. and so the destroyer escorts fanned out in a similar search pattern to the one used against I-16, a line abreast covering about 16,000 yards. This time, USS Rabi detected a surface submarine. This one was RO-104, but between it and the George, 8 Hedgehog attacks yielded no results, as this sub's radar detector had worked properly and it had managed to crash dive before the US ships could close to searchlight or sonar range. England had been furthest from the point of detection and listened as one salvo after another from its fellows failed to find a target. Then, 2.5 hours after the first sight of the target, England rolled up, missed with one salvo, and then nailed the unlucky submarine with the majority of the next one. The dozen or so hits netting another large explosion and oil slick. The destroyer escorts then pressed on up the Japanese line. The following morning, their continued persistence paid off as RO-116 appeared on George's radar. Again, this ship's radar detector worked properly and the submarine dived, leading to a very long chase, including a clever sub-captain pinging his own sonar every time the US ships did, which completely messed with the American sonar as the Japanese submarine had dialed in its sonar to the same frequency, thus giving numerous false returns to the American receiver. However, an hour or so in, England got a one salvo, one kill, its accuracy clearly increasing all the time. Interestingly, this particular kill didn't net the massive underwater detonation that characterized the previous kills, simply the sounds of a gradual breaking up along with the customary oil and debris slick. At this point, further down the line, RO-109 began to get somewhat suspicious of its companions falling silent one after the other, and withdrew, which would save the submarine, at least for now. 2 days later, with 4 kills already to its name, the England and its companions were relieved by a new force that included an escort carrier and the soon-to-be famous destroyers USS Heermann and USS Hoel, amongst others. The destroyer escorts were sent to refuel and rearm, but the fact that the nearest friendly port was in the other operational zone led the destroyer escorts to keep up a search pattern on the way, as they knew that there were 2 war submarines that should be in the area, and, well, might as well make the best of the journey. They were rewarded by RO-108 showing up, also surfaced and visible on radar late at night. Much like the previous attack, England rolled up, launched a Hedgehog salvo, and scored an instant kill. And again, like the last attack, this submarine also died relatively quietly. At this point, based on their own signals intercepts, the Japanese realized that the line was being rolled up and they were desperately calling on all surviving submarines to withdraw. But of course, the majority of them had already been forcibly withdrawn from active service and reassigned to reef duty. The only submarines that actually acknowledged the signal were RO-109, which had already moved of its own accord, and RO-112, which now relocated. But 3 days later, having refueled, rearmed, and picked up another destroyer escort, USS Spangler, for company, the destroyer escort unit continued their search route, and it turned out that RO-105 had, for whatever reason, not responded to the calls of its squadron commander, and was thus found by one of the newly arrived destroyers from the Hunter-Killer group. But RO-105's captain was good, very good, and for the next 25 hours, the George and Rabi helped the destroyer chase the submarine all over the ocean to little apparent effect. The Japanese vessel capped this off by managing to surface for air and battery recharge by popping up directly between the George and the Rabi, so that if either of them fired, a miss would result in a hit on another friendly ship. Their firepower thus neutered, the submarine managed to recharge some of its batteries and dive again before other units could show up with a clear fire line. Further Hedgehog attacks still failed to yield a result, and England, which had been coming up from some distance away and had been told in no uncertain terms by some of the other ships to stay away because they wanted a go, was now allowed by Commander Haynes to show everyone else how it was done, scoring its 6th kill with yet another single salvo and eliciting, "How on earth do you do it?" from the division commander. This time the kill was underlined by a satisfyingly large explosion, like some of the earlier ones. Somewhat unsurprisingly, for its performance, the ship would receive a Presidential Unit Citation, before going on to see out the rest of the war in a somewhat more mundane fashion. Japanese submarines presumably now avoiding the ship on principle and by instinct, and so escort and supply missions would form the rest of her war service until in May 1945 she was hit by a kamikaze dive bomber that she'd just shot down. Although losing almost 40 men killed and another couple of dozen wounded, she was able to just about put out the resulting fires, stem the flooding, and make it safely back to port, at least under tow, which was something of a testament to the US Navy's damage control training once again, as most ships of this size would not normally survive an amidships hit by a fully loaded dive bomber. Sent home for repairs and conversion into a high-speed troop transport, which would be the fate of quite a number of late-war destroyer escorts, she was still in dock when the war ended, and with so many destroyer escorts in service, including quite a number of later and thus more modern classes, it was deemed uneconomical to repair the ship, and unfortunately she would be sold for scrapping at the end of 1946.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.